In the last video, we looked at raw Redux. Through all of our Redux videos so far, we've seen Redux in the context of react-redux. That's react-redux, that library. That's everything so far. This time, last time though, we looked at just plain Redux. What we're going to do this time is we're going to look at the source code of Redux and recreate part of it. As an exercise in understanding how it works. That's our goal. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking here at the source code for Redux. And so I totally recommend taking some time to look through here. And if at any point I am going too fast and you want to take a look at the source code, then by all means pause me and then go look at the source code. And so go to react.js/redux on GitHub, and then go to source, and then go to createStore, because this is what we're going to be mostly implementing today. Now, when I say mostly, what do I mean? Well, we're going to implement everything that we need for building the application we built last time. In other words, we need dispatch, we need getState, and we need subscribe. We're not going to do replace reducer, and we're not going to look at observables. This lifted store we didn't actually talk about last time. This is created by the Redux plugin. We are going to get that hooked up. So that's where this lifted store thing comes in. So we'll do that towards the end of this video. So here's our app. We have a root that has nothing on it, and then a counter 1 and a counter 2. And the reason why, if you didn't get it, why we're using React Router, if you didn't get it in the last video, it's because we needed to check the unsubscribe functionality. And so that's something we did last time. So we're going to do all that in this video this time. So let's get started with the code. I'm going to start by duplicating counter 1 and calling it counter 2. So let's get rid of counter 1 here, at least close the tab. Here with counter 2, let's rename it. All right, so essentially what we want to do, yeah, that's it there. What we want to do is we want to implement enough of Redux so that we can keep all of this code. My plan is for us to not have to change a single line of the component. We are, after all, creating a copy of Redux. So no changing anything here. As we go along, I'll actually comment out a lot of things so it will run. But in the end, we will get everything back exactly the way it is right here, except not using Redux. So let's see, we've created our counter. Hey, let's go ahead and put that in the app. So import counter 2 from counter 2. And then create a route for it. All right. So now if we go look at our app, all things are going to explode, all of the things. And if we look in counter 2, well, we're using store all over the place. Well, I commented that out because we're not going to use the Redux store. So like I said, we're going to come back and redo all this code. Okay, so let's just fix it so that it doesn't explode. I can leave the action, but yeah, there's store. And this right here is actually going to be a problem because we don't have a state here. So let's see, where's this error coming from? This is coming from line 4. Oh yeah, my console log. Okay. And so if we go look at counter 2, there is no this.state.count because state doesn't exist. Let's just get rid of this for now. And we'll come back and put that in. Okay, counter 2. There we go. Counter 1 works. Counter 2 doesn't work at all because we've commented out everything. So let's create our own version of Redux. And of course, I don't want it to name it the same thing because that would be confusing. So I'm going to name it Requax. All right, so a new folder with a new index.js file. All right, well, let's see. What can we take from the other one? Well, we know there's going to be an initial state. Count. Let's just start at 1 this time, because why not? We're not going to implement createStore. No, we are going to create our own createStore. So at least not create it. We're not going to implement createStore from Redux. We'll be creating Requax. So here we go. Initial state, we need to create our first reducer. So reducer, nothing's different here actually at all. And that, okay. Console log reduce, I'll call it Requaxer. Yeah, why not? We'll just keep going with this name. And return the state. Okay, so at this point in the other one, we would have created the store. Well, we don't have that yet. So that would have been here equals a create store, passing in the reducer. And then we would have exported. So export default store. Well, let's back up. Can't do this. Well, what we can do is we can go ahead and create our own create store function. So at this point, we're going to start rewriting. So create store.js. And let's create a function. Let's say export default function create store. And let's see if we can get that here. Okay, so here in our counter, let's go ahead and import store from not Redux, but Requax, like so. Okay, well, apparently, back in my index.js, I created a horrible arrow function. Look at that. It's the worst. Okay, so create store, what did it do? Well, we've got a function called create store. Excellent. So that means we can, let's keep that there. Let's pass that in, and this is what we're going to default or export at this point. Right now, we're passing in a reducer, which we are promptly ignoring, and then returning undefined. And so this is actually undefined. And so if we go to our counter 2 and look at the store, store in the component is undefined. And so everything is flowing like we want, but there's lots of sadness because nothing works. So let's take a look at the create store function. So we've already said that we need getState, subscribe, and dispatch. And create store obviously needs to return an object with those functions. And so let's scroll down super fast to the bottom. We can see, and this is actually the bottom of create store, it returns an object that has a dispatch function, a subscribe function, and a getState function. And these two functions, which we are going to ignore. So if we scroll up, all this stuff, keep going here. So everything from line 39, export default function create store. Everything from line 39 down to 254 is the create store function. Now, first of all, notice the source code is only 254 lines for create store itself. That's not very big. Also notice they have a lot of comments. So it's actually not nearly as big as it looks because of all the comments. And in this video, we're not actually going to reproduce everything in here. And so we even have less than that. And so I'm going to give you a guided tour of the most important things just to get the basic ideas working. We don't have to handle all the error cases and check for consistencies and the functions and the objects being passed around. We don't have to do all of that just to do what we're doing here. So we're going to avoid some of it so we don't spend hours and hours redoing this. Just enough to basically get a Redux clone called requax. Okay, so if we look at the bottom, we've got this object that's going to return some things. So, well, that means at the bottom of our createStore, we can return an object. And so this object is just going to have functions on it. That's it. And so now we can see that this object is flowing through. So now in our counter we do have that object. And so I want to point you now to the second important thing in here, and this is possibly the most important variable in the whole thing. And that is, if we look at createStore and go down a few lines to line 58, we get current state. All right, current state is super duper important. Anytime you have a reducer in Redux that changes the state, it updates current state. And so that variable is representative of the state of your application. That one single thing has everything in it. Now, current state, in most cases, is going to start off as undefined. Now, it looks like we've got preloaded state here, and that comes in here. And there's this weird rigmarole stuff that's going on here that has to do with enhancers, which sounds totally cool. Well, the Redux plugin uses an enhancer to work. So I want you to trust me when I say, if you use Redux like we did in the last video, this becomes undefined. Take that back. Don't trust me. Let's just walk through it real quickly, then we'll see it later. So reducer, we're used to passing that. Let's say we're in our app and we are in the old state and we pass in this thing right here, which is a function. So if we look at the source code, it's first going to check to see is the second thing, so forget the name, second thing, is it a function? If it is a function and there's nothing in the third thing, then it swaps enhancer with preloaded state and then sets preloaded state to undefined. There you go. That's why when you pass in nothing as the second argument, or you pass in the Redux tool, you're going to fall into here, and preloaded state is going to be undefined. So let's do this and say let current state equals undefined. So that's a good place to start. All right, let's do our first function called getState. And so whenever we called getState in the previous component, hey, let's open it up. No, let's not. Let's look at counter 2, since this is that. Right here, getState, what's going to come out of here is this. All this function does, as you saw, is it returned current state, which means getting the state out of a Redux store is a really trivial thing in terms of CPU. It doesn't do any processing. It doesn't have to gather stuff together. All it's doing is returning that variable. Now, I'm assuming it's returning that variable and not giving this variable as a property so that you can't set it. You're not able to directly set this variable from anything outside of the store. You have to go through a reducer. And so therefore, it's just exporting the getState function. So if you need the state, you can just call getState, like so. And so that will return the current state. Now let's go look at our component and see if anything's blown up. No, but we can see that our getState function is there. And at this point, this console log we had in index.js, it's getting a little annoying. So I'm going to get rid of that one. So here we are. Our store is now exporting a getState function. Well, that's pretty cool. And here we can actually start using it. This will set state to undefined at this point. Let's see. Currently, the state is undefined, as we would expect. So cool. So we've got this part sort of working, but not quite working yet. Let's go back and look at our Redux code and see what would be something good. Well, subscribe will be cool, but we're going to skip that. What I want to do is, first of all, I want to zoom up real quick to the very top. Notice there's this action type called init. So add redux init. We've seen this before. If we go back to our app and go to counter 1, right, there it is. There's that init one that's firing. And so where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from right here, this dealie. So if we go down here and let's go back and find the dispatch function. So looking around, we need this dude. So dispatch action. So if we look at our component, we can see, even though it is commented out, we are going to dispatch an action. Well, that is this right here. So when you dispatch an action, it's going to go through this logic. Now, here's some checks that I'm not going to check or put in place, like this is plain object. I'm not going to do the check to see if type is undefined, though if you've been doing Redux applications, you've probably made the mistake of not passing a type. And hey, there you go. This is where that error comes from. Not going to worry about this for right now. Actually, all I want to do is I want to do this. Just this single line. And down here, this has to do with subscribing, but we'll get there in a minute. I want a dispatch function that takes an action that does just this. Okay? So let's copy that in. createStore function dispatch action. And so what does it do? Well, current reducer. Oh goodness. What is current reducer? We don't have that yet. We'll do it in a second. Current reducer, which is our reducer, we're going to pass in what is the current state, which is currently undefined, and the action. And then what comes out will be the new current state. So how does current reducer get set? So let's scroll up here. Hope I'm not making you motion sick by scrolling so much. So here's reducer. Let's follow this down. So let's do a search. Okay, well, if we're using an enhancer, which we'll get to later, that gets passed in there. It does do a check to make sure the reducer is a function. Not going to worry about that for now. Hey, look, let current reducer equals reducer. That's what we need. So let current reducer equals the reducer, which is being passed in. So reducer. So createStore takes a function, a reducer function, like so. And that's going to go in here, and that's going to go into current reducer. And current reducer gets fired anytime you call dispatch. So one last thing, and then we're going to try this because this will be cool, is one last thing is I want to look down here at the bottom. And after dispatch is implemented, keep going. Keep going. Look, right before we return the options, all the object with all the functions, look what it does. When a store is created, an init action is dispatch, so that every reducer returns their initial state. Haha! There we go. This effectively populates the initial state tree. So true. So let's take that. Well, you know what? We don't have this copied. At least the const, which is fine. So let's take this, and so after we return this, let's actually, or before we return this, let's call dispatch, and let's pass in an object of that has this as the type, which is just exactly what Redux would normally do, as we just saw. And let's go ahead and export that. So what's going to happen? Is this going to be cool? Let's find out. Hey, look, what is the state in the constructor? Count 1. Well, how did that work? Well, let's walk through it in just a second. First, I want to relish the victory that we have right here. I want to relish it and put this in here, this.state.count. I mean, because that would be a crime. Okay, there is our 1, so that if we change our initial state just to show you it works, that 2 will flow down. So how in the world did that work? Well, let's walk through it. So in here, we define an initial state, and then we define a reducer. And when you call the reducer, if state gets passed in as undefined, it will use this instead. That's the parameter defaulting here. And so if this is passed in as undefined, and only when it's passed in as undefined, it will use this. Well, is there a time where it is passed in undefined? Yes, as we shall see. And then there's the action. And so right now, all we're doing is returning the state. Okay. And then let's see, createStore passes in the reducer. So this is where we go into that code we've been running. So let's go to the top and follow it down. So here's the reducer. And we define current state as undefined. Very important. Very. Current reducer is the reducer passed in. So we defined a function called getState, which just returns the state. We defined a function called dispatch, which takes an action. It calls the current reducer with whatever is here and an action. So that's what dispatch does. And then we dispatch an action. Now the first time through, the very first time we call createStore. All right, so it's gonna pass in reducer, this function. And so current state will be undefined. Current reducer will be the reducer passed in. Define a function, pass in or dispatch an action. This action comes in here. Current state is undefined right now. Because current state is undefined right now, the initial state is used. So therefore, whenever we jump into current reducer, the reducer we created, because this was undefined, it shows up as this object right here, the very first time. That's put into state, so that when we return state, it goes to here, and current state will never be undefined unless I make it undefined through my own code, and I won't from here on out. It will never be undefined again. So now, every further time that actions are dispatched, it will come here and this will never be undefined, and so therefore the initial state will never be used again. And then it'll go through this logic that we've got there. All right. So the first time it dispatches, current state is undefined, it goes through our reducer, we come out with our initial state. That's where we're at. That's how the flow works. And then we return this, and so by the time we get the store out, it's already been initialized. It's done. It's pretty fancy. Okay, so because of all of that, some of these pieces now work. Our initial state works. I think we can get rid of that console log now. Our initial state works. We don't have subscribe and therefore don't have unsubscribe. We do have dispatch in theory. So let's try it. At the very least, if this is working right, we should be able to see the actions go through the state. Now right now, the actions, hey look, are going through requacker. And so we see the type there. But if we look in our reducer, well, we don't do anything with any of the actions. So let's do just like we did in the old store. Let's do a switch on action.type. Let's see, state, and then we will take the count up by 1, like so. And just like last time, let's also create a default and move this up a bit. Okay, increment. It's going through. Is it making any changes to the state? I'm not sure. Let's put some console logs in. Console log, you dispatched state now current state. So let's see if it's actually updating. State is now 3, 4, 5, 6. So our dispatch is working. Fantastic. Nothing else to do right there, right now. At least to get the state changes happening. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's go back and look at our component. As we noticed, the state changes are happening, but our component is not updating. Well, that gets back to this subscription bit. This is all we're missing right now, is just this subscription bit. And so let's work on this. Let's do this, all right? And right now, we're just going to do subscribe, not this unsubscribe bit. So this will just come back as undefined, and we'll deal with it in a second. So we need a function called subscribe. And so when component did mount happens, we'll subscribe, pass in a function as we described in the last video, so that whenever things change, we will get updated. Now if we go look here, all sorts of things are exploding. And this is because I'm using the subscribe function, which currently doesn't exist. So let's get the explosions to go away. Subscribe. You know what? Function keyword. All right, so that's there. Let's go ahead and export it. Now at least that explosion will go away. The subscription doesn't work yet. We haven't done anything. But at least it is exported. So now how does that work? All right, so back to the Redux source code. So it's time to scroll again. So we need to go to, let's just look it up. Subscribe listener. Okay, cool. So here's the basic logic of this, skipping over the stuff that we don't need right now, which isn't very long. We're not going to check to see if they're functions. Is subscribe, not going to worry about it, not going to worry about it. Actually, this is the line we want. And that's it until we do unsubscribe. So next listeners, push listener. Well, what is next listeners? Well, it's nothing complicated. Next listeners is, well, we created an array. He creates an array, and then he copies a reference to that array to next listeners. Let's just make this a little easier and just say let listeners. We'll go with that for now. So here's our listeners. And if we go back down to our subscribe, we need to push whatever gets passed into the subscribe function onto that array. Okay, so listener. So this is a listener that's being passed in, something that listens for the event. I'm going to say listeners, push this listener on. And I'm going to put a console log here. This will help us see what's going on. I'm going to say how many listeners? Listeners dot length. Okay, so whenever we go back to our counter, we can see that this function is passed in here. So this whole thing is the listener, not this. This is the content of that listener. This is the listener, this whole function. So that's going to go in and get pushed onto this array. Okay. Now, as you might guess, how many listeners do we have? One. This still isn't working. I mean, we just added a function to an array. Nothing special there. So, well, let's take a trip back to the source code. Let's see what goes on with those listeners. Let's go to dispatch. So if we go to dispatch, dispatch in action, there's those checks, which we're not worrying about right now. And look, hey, so we get the current state from running everything through the reducer. And so then what we're going to do is we're going to get the listeners, and we are then going to loop through the listeners, get each one at a time, and just call them. Seems easy? Wait, that's not there. We need to go to dispatch. So dispatch, after the state has been changed, we need to loop through the listeners. So I is, as long as I is less than listeners, dot length. So this is each listening function, and we're going to call it like so. All right. Whoa, hey, look, that's working. Cool. So what's the flow? How in the world does this work? Well, let's walk through it. In our counter, we are subscribing, and we're passing a function in, like so. What that does is that goes into here, into the subscribe function. This listener gets pushed onto an array. And now, every time a dispatch happens, what it does is it, of course, sends the data through the reducer, or sends the action. So we've got a current state. We're going to pass it into the reducer with the action. The state may come back with different data. We're going to now loop through the listeners and get each one at a time and call them. So how does that update the component? It doesn't, actually. All it does is says, things happened. And so then in the component itself, we will go and call setState and say, okay, setState, well, let me get the state from the store, which this is our first function we implemented in here. Just returns the current state. And so we're going to say, okay, get the state, and then call setState on that. And that's what causes the re-render. And then this gets updated. So that's the flow, actually. Hey, let's refresh it for fun. It's cool. See that working. All right, now I'm going to cause a problem. Root, counter. Oh, there's the error we saw last time. So what is this? Let's revisit. So essentially, I'm calling setState on an unmounted component. So how is that working? Well, just like last time, actually, I've subscribed to any changes to the store, and I've passed in this function which holds a reference to this component. When I leave, when component unmount happens, I should be unsubscribing, but I'm not. And so if I go to root, I can see, look at unmounted. I go here, I unmounted, doing lots of unmounting. But when I come back and I call increment, whoa, look at all these warnings. It's because even though I am unmounting them, the subscription is keeping a reference to that instance of the component. And so therefore that's a problem. And really the source of this error. So let's see how Redux handles this. And so if we go and look at the subscribe function, first let's go look and see here. Subscribe function, what's the answer from the external view of the API? We look at subscribe and it returns an unsub function. And so this is the solution right there. And so how does that work? Well, let's go look at the source code. Let's see, replace reducer, no. We don't need dispatch, we need subscribe. So subscribe. Let's go to where we ended last time, which is next listeners, push. And we return, hey, a function. So it's going to return this function called unsubscribe, which isn't all that important in terms of the actual functionality, what it's called here, but return function unsubscribe. And let's skip this for now. I do want to come back to that. Hopefully I will remember. We're going to return this function unsubscribe, and then we're going to get the index of the listener that was passed in, and then splice it out of the array. That seems kind of strange. Let's walk through it. So in subscribe, let's find that. return function unsubscribe like so. Let's just see this function firing. I want to see this console log happening. I've got a counter. This function should be returned here, so when we unmount, it should console log when we call unsub. That's my goal. It won't actually unsub yet. So increment a few times. Let's go to root. Let's come back. Unsubscribing. Hey, whenever we left, we still have an error. But whenever we leave, it unsubscribes. Console log unsubscribes, but it doesn't. And so come back, leave. So that part is firing. All right. So this function that we returned from subscribe is getting stored in the instance, and then we're calling it on unmount. So now let's make it do something useful. So if we go back to our code here and look at this and say, okay, let's get the index of. And so next listeners, remember that's an array right there. Listeners, this is an array of functions. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the index of, the location of the listener in the function. Well, if let's say there's nothing in the array, all right, we call subscribe for the first time. Listener is going to come through, and it's going to be added to the array. And so whenever it returns this function, it is at that point going to be able to, say it this way, it's going to return this function so that later when it's called, it can look and find the index of that listener. It's not going to find the index of the listener when this was returned. If it did that, then if any of the listeners changed the index numbers, like let's say you remove one that's earlier in the list, that would actually mess up all of the unsubscribed functions. Hope that makes sense. And so what it has to do is wait until you unsubscribe. And so if you pass a function in here, an index of, it's going to look in this array and find that particular function that you passed in there. And so that's going to get what we want there. So where's our unsubscribe? There it is. So that gets the index. And then we are going to say, of course, we called it listeners. So then we said listeners.splice. Well, we want to splice at that location, and we want to go 1. So splice, as you may or may not recall, what it does is it, at that index, will remove the thing from the array. And it'll remove as many things as you pass in. So if you want to just remove a thing at a single location, you pass in the index and you pass in 1. And it'll remove something in that location. It'll leave the original array without that item. So splice will actually return the spliced out items, which we're ignoring right now. But it will remove it from that item that we called splice on. So if you had 5 functions in there and you spliced out the thing at index 2, it would now have 4 things in it where the spliced thing would be taken out. So what is the net effect of that? Well, the net effect of that is awesomeness, because if you call unsubscribe, it will remove that function from there, which means the next time you dispatch and it loops over the functions, they won't be there. That one won't. And so therefore, it's not going to call the listener, and therefore will not call setState on an unmounted component. So let's go see if it actually works. So increment a few times, go to root, go to counter. Yes! That makes me happy. Okay, every time we unmount, we are getting rid of a listener. So, you know what, let's put another console log right here and say console log, how many listeners after unsub, and say listeners, not length. So we have 1 listener here, we unsub, and so how many after we leave? 0. Come back, we have 1. We leave, there's 0. Come back, we have 1, and so forth. Works very well. Now, I actually would say that this is a pretty useful one right here. Okay. So what's going on here? Well, see this variable. This is redefined every time subscribe is called, which means the first, let's say when the first listener comes in here, it's going to define this variable and set a value of true. This function, which is returned, is going to remember that. This is a closure, if you're wondering. It's going to remember the value of that variable. And so is subscribed will be remembered. And so this little check right here that they put like so. Hey, let's put that in our code. And then let's see. Let is subscribed equals true. Did I get all my variables correct? Okay, so let's go through a scenario here. What is this actually doing? So let's say we've passed our listener in here, is subscribed is true, we return our function. We call unsubscribe. If is subscribed not, meaning if is subscribed is false, return. Well, it's not, it's true. We set it here. So therefore it comes here and then it sets false there, and then it moves on and resplices. If for some reason we accidentally call unsubscribe twice, what this will then do is, well, the next time through, it will remember that is subscribed is false, and so therefore that will be true, and therefore it will return. So if you call unsubscribe 10 times for a given function, it's actually only going to remove one thing. One splicing will happen because of this. I'd call that one pretty important, so I just figured I'd throw that in. Okay, at this point, we have a fully functioning app, except Redux. Well, this thing is actually listening to this Redux counter. You know what? Let's take it out of the other one so we can see what it would be like to implement it in this one. Okay, so now if we go back, let's see. Counter 2, no store found, nor in counter 1 either. Okay, so counter 2, no store found, follow the instructions. We don't need to follow the instructions. I just basically stole that from Redux to use in Requax. And so here in index, I need to pass this. Now we get to back up to that discussion we had a while back in this video about the enhancers. So if we go look at the top here, we're almost done. Reducer, preloaded, state, and enhancer. The store enhancer, you may optionally specify it to enhance the store with third-party capabilities such as middleware, time travel, persistence, etc. The only store enhancer that ships with Redux is apply middleware. Well, we're using a different one. We're using the Redux Chrome plugin. Now, in the original store, they supported this preloaded state thing. So let's not worry about that. Let's just go with the enhancer as the second argument for right now. So here in createStore, we're going to say enhancer. And we're going to do exactly what the other one did. Well, almost. We're going to say if enhancer not undefined, or I think how they did it is they probably just did a type of. Let's go look. Yeah, when they're looking at their types here, they're actually going type of function and type of enhancers undefined. Anyway, so if we go back here, if we, I'm going to go back to source code. If we have an enhancer, what do you do? Well, we're going to return like so. Essentially, we're giving, we don't need that because we're not doing the preloaded state. We're calling the enhancer and passing in this, well, this createStore function, and then passing in the reducer. Now, is this going to work? Hey, cool. Okay, let's see. See that? Look at that coolness. And so what we've done is we have now not only recreated Redux, but we've also hooked up the Redux app, the Chrome app for debugging. So that's cool. We can actually go back and look at the state and stuff. Let's see if jump works. Oh yeah, we can even jump back in time. Jump to there. Okay. Okay, now looking at this complete, all right, to get the basic Redux store without all the comments, just a few console logs, and without a lot of the sanity checks of, okay, did you pass an action in as an object, and did you pass in a type, and things like that. To just get the basic functionality, we did it in roughly 50 lines. That's what I mean by saying Redux doesn't actually have all that many moving pieces to it. It's not trivial, but it's not huge. So, and notice we did it here with, well, this is basically the exact same code as we had in the other one, except that we imported it slightly differently. And counter 2 has the same API to Redux, same function names, works exactly the same and all that. Now, just to be clear, I don't think people should be recreating requacks and using that in their production applications. Redux works just great and is better. So keep using Redux. This was just an exercise in learning and thinking through how Redux works. That was the goal here. I hope you found something useful in this. If you are new to Redux and this has been kind of a whirlwind and seemed pretty complicated, then what I'd recommend you do is just keep using Redux regularly. Maybe use it some without react-redux, and then come back and work through this again. It's good to understand how your tool works. This will help you see the internals. Like one of the things that I first had to come to whenever I was learning Redux is going, okay, if I call getState a lot, is this an expensive call? Does it do lots of CPU stuff? Are you making lots of objects? Are you doing computation when you call getState? And just look at the source code. Actually, no. All it does is return a variable. And so therefore I can call getState as much as I want. And I don't have to worry about performance. And so that's the kind of thing you can get by looking at source code. Okay, that's it here. My plan is in my next video, assuming I don't change my plans, my plan in my next video is to work through combined reducers. First, I will show you how to use combined reducers, and I may do that without recreating it. And then what I will do is I will come in and recreate it in the context of requacks here in this, either this or a similar application.